No crime scene, no body, just a line of blood leading to Holmes's door. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Drop a quick comment. Where in the world are you listening from? I always look forward to hearing from you. Let's begin. It was on one of those rare London mornings when even the most cynical souls remarked upon the golden light flooding through the fog-streaked windows of Baker Street, a break in the interminable grey, as if the city had momentarily shrugged off its sullen overcoat. I had just returned from a patient on Cavendish Square and was preparing to spend a quiet hour with a monograph on forensic pathology when I found Holmes already engaged, though not, as I first suspected, with a case. He stood in front of the window, immobile, his hands clasped behind his back, and his hawk-like gaze fixed on the street below. His pipe lay untouched on the table, and the morning papers were unopened. That, in itself, was suspicious. "You have seen something," I said lightly, laying my medical bag beside the hearth. "Or are you composing a violin concerto in your head again?" Without turning, he replied, "Neither, Watson. I am simply waiting for a corpse to arrive." I blinked. "A what, Holmes?" He finally turned, his face a mask of calm amusement. "To be more precise, a client. But I expect he will be a corpse soon enough, if he is not one already." Before I could demand an explanation, a loud, desperate knock rattled the door downstairs. Mrs. Hudson's startled voice echoed faintly from the hall, followed by hurried steps on the stairs. Then the door burst open, and in came a man, barely more than a boy, his coat dishevelled, his face pale and glistening with rain and sweat. He staggered forward 2 steps, leaving a trail behind him. Blood. A dark, gleaming line stained the carpet from the threshold to his boots, and his right hand clutched his side with an urgency born of mortal pain. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, eyes wide with panic. "You must help me. There's been a—" He collapsed mid-sentence, the breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. I was beside him in an instant, fingers already feeling for a pulse. He was still alive, but the bleeding was severe. "A wound to the abdomen," I muttered, tearing at his coat. "A deep one. Knife, I think. We must stop the bleeding, or he'll be dead before we learn a word." Holmes knelt beside me. "Do what you can, Watson. His story is the case." I worked quickly, staunching the blood with a compress and applying pressure. Holmes, meanwhile, had seized the fallen man's satchel and rifled through its contents with cool precision. He extracted a folded piece of parchment, stained with fresh blood. "Curious," he murmured, holding it to the light. "No name, but this is not the work of an amateur." I looked up. "What does it say?" Holmes read aloud. "They watch every corner, every lamp, but the blood will speak. Baker Street is not safe." Before either of us could ponder its meaning, the man on the floor stirred and opened his eyes with startling clarity. He gripped Holmes's sleeve with a strength that belied his condition. Don't let them find the girl," he rasped. Holmes leaned close. "What girl?" But the man gave no reply. His body went limp. I sat back on my heels and shook my head slowly. "He's gone." For a long moment, Holmes said nothing. He stood and walked to the window, once again peering down at the street. "So it begins," he said softly. I rose, brushing the blood from my hands with a handkerchief. "Holmes, what did he mean? Who is they? And what girl?" Instead of answering, Holmes turned abruptly and began gathering his coat and walking stick. "To Scotland Yard, Watson," he said briskly, "before Lestrade bungles this, as he did the Camberwell conundrum. But first, have a look at this." He lifted the satchel again
and from a hidden side pocket withdrew something I hadn't noticed before, a lady's glove. It was slender, expensive, and soaked along the fingers with blood, and it matched neither the man's size nor style. "Whoever this girl is," Holmes said gravely, "she may already be dead, or worse. But someone has gone to great lengths to see that we never find her. Let us see if we can disappoint them." And with that, we were off into the London morning, the trail of blood behind us and mystery ahead. Holmes and I emerged from 221B Baker Street with the urgency of men chasing the tail end of a storm. The morning sun had already lost its warmth to the encroaching clouds, and the growing chill in the air seemed to echo the grim urgency of our errand. Holmes hailed a cab with his usual imperious snap of the fingers, and we climbed aboard, the coach rattling eastward through the winding London streets. "Lestrade will have heard nothing of this yet," Holmes said, fingers drumming thoughtfully against the window pane. "We have the advantage of the first move, though I dare say it will not last long. Scotland Yard is a lumbering beast, but even it can trample a trail if it steps in early enough." I glanced at the bloodied glove in his lap. "And you truly believe this woman, whoever she is, was involved in the incident that brought our visitor to death's door?" "Involved, yes," Holmes said, turning the glove over. "But not necessarily culpable. Consider. The man came to me, not the police. He risked his last breath to speak of her and of unseen watchers. That is the voice of protection, not accusation." "What of the note?" I asked. "It warned of danger right on our doorstep. Someone must know he came to you." Holmes nodded. "Which means we must move quickly before they sweep away the traces. They have tried to prevent this trail from leading anywhere but to silence." We arrived at the police station on Bow Street, where we found Inspector
Lestrade already haranguing a constable over a burglary in Soho. His thin face lit with both curiosity and suspicion when Holmes strode in like a storm front. "I was just thinking of you, Holmes," Lestrade said, hands on his hips, "though I dare say I wasn't expecting blood on your carpet." "You'll want to send a man to Baker Street," Holmes said at once. "There's a body in my sitting room, died not 10 minutes past, knife wound. Male, approximately 25, 5'9", carrying a coded note, and this." He held out the glove. Lestrade took it with care, brows rising. "And what, may I ask, makes this your concern instead of mine?" "The man came to me directly," Holmes said coolly. "He left a blood trail from the doorstep to the hearth. I should say the matter concerns me quite intimately." Lestrade grunted. "And what exactly do you know?" "Not enough," Holmes replied, "which is why I require access to any stabbing incidents reported in the last 24 hours, particularly any that mention a missing woman, watchers, or the area around Baker Street." Lestrade gave Holmes a long look, then barked at the sergeant behind him. "Fetch last night's violent incident records. Now." As the reports were gathered, Holmes and I stood to one side, the bustle of the station passing around us. He took a moment to examine the parchment again. I watched his eyes flick across the lines as if searching for a code, not in the words, but in the shape of them. "Holmes," I said after a moment, "do you truly believe this man stumbled all the way from wherever he was attacked to our door?" "It would take strength and luck." "He was hunted, Watson. You saw how he collapsed. But instinct is often strongest in our last moments. He had something to protect, someone to warn us about. And he knew I was the only one who might follow the truth rather than the evidence laid out for show." The sergeant returned with a thin sheaf of paper, which Lestrade handed over with a sceptical grunt. Holmes flipped through quickly until his finger paused at one entry. He read it aloud in a clipped tone. "At 11:43 p.m., A witness reports hearing a scuffle in the alley behind Granby Street near Regent's Park. A constable found signs of a struggle, blood on the bricks, but no body. Witness described a young man fleeing, clutching his side. No suspect apprehended. He snapped the file shut. Granby Street, that's less than a mile from Baker Street. He made it most of the way on foot. Remarkable. "I'll send men to canvass the area," Lestrade said, already making notes. Holmes didn't wait. "And I shall go there myself before the scene is trampled into irrelevance. Come, Watson." We left the station and arrived at Granby Street just past noon. The alley behind the row of shops was narrow and fetid, the stench of old rubbish mixing with the iron tang of blood, still fresh, on the stone. Holmes crouched by the wall, his hand brushing lightly over the stains, eyes flicking along the uneven ground like a predator hunting spoor. "Here," he murmured. "Blood at shoulder height. He was shoved hard into this wall. Note the smear. A slash, not a stab, came first. Defensive wound, perhaps, then he turned and fled." He stood and walked further down the alley, pausing beneath a boarded window. "Paint," he said, pointing. "Red, still tacky. Look at the smear along the base of the wall. Someone repainted this section in haste. Why, Watson, would one paint in the dark?" "To cover something," I said. "Graffiti?" Holmes was already pulling a small penknife from his coat. He chipped at the edge of the paint, revealing black lettering beneath. "Exactly," he said, "and I believe our message is still here." He worked quickly, revealing a partial scrawl in black. B3K, th, Underlam. Holmes frowned, mouthing the words. "Baker Street." "The trail leads to Baker Street, but someone tried to stop it here. And Underlam could be lamp, lamplight, or even a name." I stepped back. Could it be a message for someone else, not just a warning? "It's both," Holmes said, standing. "Someone was to follow this trail, but the message was interrupted, and someone came back to erase it." We returned to the mouth of the alley. Holmes was silent, his brows drawn tight with calculation. Then suddenly he said, "Watson, do you recall the glove?" "Of course." "There is embroidery inside, the faintest script, CF in gold thread. I had dismissed it earlier as mere monogramming, but no, CF may be the key to the woman our late visitor mentioned. She may not be dead yet." "Then we must find her." "We shall, but we must first discover who they are, the ones watching, erasing, hunting." And the message on this wall was not their only attempt at concealment. We were walking briskly now, Holmes's coat flaring behind him as he spoke. "Watson, if a woman in danger carries a monogrammed glove, then someone knows her by those initials. I'll wager that at least one society column or public registry will have mention of a young lady, perhaps titled, perhaps merely wealthy, whose initials are CF. "You think this is about class?" I asked. "I think it's about secrets," Holmes replied. "And the higher the pedigree, the deadlier the fallout." Back at Baker Street, the constables had removed the body, and the sitting room bore only the faintest traces of blood, though Mrs. Hudson's huffing and clucking could be heard clearly from the hall. Holmes went straight to his archive, a long shelf, crammed with slim volumes of gossip, peerage records, and London social announcements. "Let us see," he murmured, fingers flying. "See, Clara Finlay, no. Catherine Farrow, too old."
"Ah, Charlotte Fenwick, debuted last autumn. Daughter of Sir Reuben Fenwick, textile magnate. Recently withdrawn from society under ill health." He turned to me, eyes glittering. "Tell me, Watson, what sort of ill health causes a young woman to vanish entirely from London's social calendar after a single season?" Before I could hazard a guess, there was a knock at the door, not the frantic thump of a dying man this time, but a cautious, deliberate knock. Holmes tilted his head. "Expecting someone?" I asked. "No," Holmes said, already moving toward the door.
but I suspect the game is about to shift again." He opened it. A woman stood there, dressed in a dark travelling cloak, soaked from rain, her face half concealed beneath a wide hat. She raised her eyes to Holmes and whispered, "They told me not to come, but I think they've already killed Henry. Please tell me he came here." Holmes did not answer at once. He stepped aside with grave courtesy. "Come in, Miss Fenwick," he said. Watson's hand tightened on the glove in his pocket, and thus the shadows around Baker Street deepened. The door shut behind Miss Charlotte Fenwick with a hushed click, muffled only by the distant murmur of Mrs. Hudson returning to her kitchen below. The room seemed to draw still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Rain whispered against the window panes like an impatient messenger, and for a long moment none of us spoke. Miss Fenwick stood just inside the threshold, dripping water onto the threadbare rug, her gloved hands clenched tightly before her. Her hat, broad-brimmed and shadowing her face, did little to conceal the sharp panic in her eyes. She was young, scarcely past 20, with pale skin drawn taut over high cheekbones and lips that trembled despite her efforts to still them. Holmes regarded her with his usual keen scrutiny, not cruel, but unrelenting in its precision. He gestured gently toward the armchair near the fire, and she sank into it with the weary grace of someone who had spent the night fleeing shadows. "I presume," Holmes said softly, "that Henry was the young man who arrived here shortly before noon, collapsed at our feet, and died with your name half on his lips." She inhaled sharply and covered her mouth. "Then it's true. Oh, Henry!" The whisper cracked like ice breaking. "You may speak freely, Miss Fenwick," Holmes continued, seating himself opposite her. "But I advise you to speak carefully. Every word now may alter the path ahead. Start at the beginning, and omit nothing." I fetched a blanket from the hall to place around her shoulders. She gave me a small, grateful nod before composing herself with visible effort. Her voice, when it came, was clearer but tinged with dread. "Henry Langford was my tutor last spring. He worked at the London College of Music and was hired by my father to instruct me in composition and piano. We became friends. Her voice faltered. In time we became more. Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Your father approved?" "No," she said bitterly. "Father didn't approve of anything he hadn't arranged himself. He wanted me married into the Follingsby line, a viscount's son, you understand. All society, no substance. But Henry was different. He was kind, brilliant. He had such dreams." She paused, her eyes distant. 2 months ago we tried to elope. We'd planned it for weeks, but someone must have discovered us. That night I waited at the agreed spot near Regent's Park. Henry never came. "Did you try to find him?" I asked. "I did," she said, her voice tight. "I sent letters, visited his lodgings, gone, evicted without explanation. The landlady said he'd vanished overnight. No luggage, no farewells. I didn't know whether he had changed his mind or been forced to leave." "And now?" Holmes asked. She looked up at him with eyes too hollow for her age. "Now I know he was being hunted. He wouldn't have run without me, not Henry." Holmes leaned forward. "Who knew of your plans?" "No one, only Henry and I. We were careful." "Forgive me, but that's never quite true," he said. "People leave traces, reactions. Tell me, your father, you said he's powerful?" "Sir Reuben Fenwick," she replied. "He owns 3 mills in Manchester and has friends in Parliament. He's always had men around the house. Private security, he says, but they follow people, they listen." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Men watching corners and lamplights, perhaps?" She startled. "Yes, how did you—" "The note Henry carried," I said gently. "He wrote, They watch every corner, every lamp. She went pale again, and for a moment I thought she might faint. But she held steady. Holmes stood and walked to the mantel, staring into the flickering fire. "You said Henry disappeared 2 months ago, and yet he re-emerged today, wounded, bleeding, and carrying a message meant to reach me. That suggests he's been alive, somewhere, for all this time. Where?" Miss Fenwick's brow furrowed. I don't know. But 2 days ago I received a note, no signature, just a slip of paper in my dressing-gown pocket. Holmes turned. "You still have it?" She reached into her cloak and produced a crumpled scrap. Holmes took it carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried, and spidery. "B3K, follow the red under lamplight." "He may still have the voice to save you." "B3K, again," Holmes murmured. "It's on the wall behind Granby Street. The message Henry tried to leave. Someone else wanted to guide her, whoever planted this in your room." He turned sharply to her. "And did you follow it?" She shook her head. "No, I was afraid. But this morning I saw the paper again, folded beside my breakfast tray. I knew then someone in the house was helping me, or watching me very closely. So I left. I went to the address listed in the phone book under your name." Holmes tapped the message against his hand, his mind racing. "Someone inside your house, perhaps a servant, or a man posing as one, has been trying to get the truth to the surface. Henry must have escaped his captors just long enough to send this final cry, and they painted over it almost immediately. Watson and I found the paint still wet." She bowed her head. "Then it's worse than I feared." Holmes was pacing now. "I must know everything about your father's men, who they are, when they arrived, how they move." "There are 3 who remain constantly near," she said. "Mr. Keene, who drives my father's motor car. Mr. Darrick, who never speaks and smokes constantly on the back terrace. And a 3rd, Mr. Ellis. He came only recently. He carries a cane and speaks with a northern accent." Holmes stopped in his tracks. "Ellis, tall, pale, clean-shaven?" "Yes, you know him." "I know of him," Holmes said. "A man who has sold his skills to industrialists before. Not a hired thug, but a manipulator, a finder of men who disappear. If Ellis was involved, Henry did not leave quietly. He was taken." Holmes's eyes burned with certainty. "And if he was taken by your father's men, Miss Fenwick, then your father knows exactly what happened, and likely why." Her voice trembled. "Then what do we do?" Holmes's reply was immediate. "We confront him, but not directly. First, we must retrieve something that was taken. Something I believe Henry left behind." I looked at him, puzzled. "Where?" "In the alley off Granby Street," he said, already reaching for his coat. The message on the wall was rushed, incomplete. But why choose that precise wall? It was behind a disused bakery, shielded from the street. He could have made it further, but he stopped there. "To write the message?" I offered. "To leave something more, a clue too dangerous to carry. Watson, bring the lantern. Miss Fenwick, you must stay here and remain unseen. I'll ask Mrs. Hudson to let no one in." "But if they find me—" "They won't," Holmes said, "because they believe the trail is cold." I helped Miss Fenwick to the guest room and returned to find Holmes already halfway down the stairs. The cab ride to Granby Street was silent, save for the tapping of Holmes's fingers against his cane. The alley had grown darker with the early London dusk. Holmes made straight for the boarded window, and then to the crates stacked beside it. "There," he said, gesturing to a cracked crate. "Blood on the edge." He leaned here, briefly. "And beneath it—" We lifted the lid and peered in. Beneath the broken planks, tucked into a hollow crevice, was a rolled scrap of vellum tied with thin string. Holmes retrieved it gently, inspecting the seal. "A musical staff," he whispered, treble clef inked in red. He unrolled it slowly. Inside was a piece of sheet music, only a few bars long. But as he studied it, Holmes's expression changed. "These aren't just notes, Watson," he said. He held it up to the lantern's glow. "It's a cipher." Holmes held the scrap of vellum up to the flickering light, his eyes darting over the bars of music with the same focused intensity I had seen him apply to bloodstains, cigarette ash, or coded telegrams. Though I was no stranger to musical notation, what lay before us was far from a common melody. "It's in G major," I offered, squinting at the neat rows of notes. "But it's incomplete, only a few measures, barely enough for a phrase." Holmes nodded absently, lips pursed in thought. "A melody too short to sing, too structured to be random. It is precisely the sort of thing one would write if one were attempting to cloak language in another form. Henry Langford was a music tutor, Watson. He would know how to bury a message where only someone fluent in both melody and meaning could decipher it." He pulled out his pocket notebook and began sketching, converting each note into a corresponding letter using a method I did not yet follow. I stood by, the wind licking through the narrow alley, thinking uneasily of Miss Fenwick, waiting in the shadowed warmth of our sitting room, and the men she feared watching from unseen corners. Holmes worked quickly, muttering to himself as he mapped each musical note against an alphabetic cipher, then paused. "Here," he said, jabbing at the page with the end of his pencil. "It begins with a descending fifth, a musical interval associated with the letter S in certain ciphers. If we follow the German alphanumeric standard, a common choice among composers, we arrive at this." He scribbled a line beneath the notation, then read aloud, "Speak to Ellis under gaslight." My spine stiffened. "Ellis, the very man Miss Fenwick named. Do you suppose this is a warning or an instruction?" "Perhaps both," Holmes replied, his tone grim. "Langford, we now know, was alive long enough to compose this and hide it. The cipher suggests he either conversed with Ellis or believed Ellis to be a point of contact, perhaps even a reluctant conspirator. What matters most is the second half. Under gaslight. That could refer to a location." He stood and tucked the vellum safely into an inner pocket. "We must return to Baker Street. I must consult the city's gaslight grid." We hired a cab once more, and Holmes sat silently through the ride, his gaze lost in thought while his fingers moved almost unconsciously along the rim of his walking stick. The rain had returned, a fine mist that haloed the lamps and cast the streets in watery gold. London's familiar fog had thickened with evening, and it wrapped around the cab as if to hush our conversation and mask every movement. Once inside 221B, Holmes immediately cleared a space at his desk and retrieved a city infrastructure map from the cabinet beside the bookcase. I stoked the fire and checked on Miss Fenwick, who remained in the guest room, curled in a shawl with anxious eyes turned to the street below. Holmes had already begun tracing paths with his pen by the time I returned. "Here," he said, tapping the map. "This particular corner near Chancery Lane boasts a historic gaslight standard, a relic from the earliest days of the city's system. Most of the lamps have since been modernized or electrified, but this one remains due to a preservation ordinance, and it lies precisely between Granby Street and the Fenwick residence." "A meeting point?" I asked. "Or a confession?" Holmes replied. "If Ellis is the thread that binds Langford's disappearance to Sir Reuben's private security apparatus, then this may be where he loosens. And I intend to be there when he does." He turned to Miss Fenwick's door, rapped once, and entered. A brief exchange followed, quiet but urgent, before he returned to the sitting room with a firm set to his jaw. "She's agreed to remain here, out of sight," he said. and should anyone come asking for her, she knows to say nothing. Now, Watson, coat and revolver. I believe we're about to speak with a man who has practiced the art of deception far longer than he's practiced loyalty. The gaslight at Chancery Lane cast an uneven glow upon the slick cobblestones, and Holmes and I arrived just as the bell at St. Dunstan's struck 7. A slight drizzle misted the air, blurring the street lamps until they glowed like phantoms in a dream. Holmes leaned against a wrought-iron fence, his eyes fixed on the corner opposite, his posture utterly still. Minutes passed. I shifted uncomfortably beside him, ever watchful. Finally, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with a deliberate gait and a cane tapping softly with each step. He approached the lamp and paused beneath it, glancing up once at its flickering flame. His face, now caught in the light, was unmistakable. "Mr. Ellis," Holmes said, stepping forward. The man's head turned slowly. "I thought you might come," he said. His voice bore the northern edge Miss Fenwick had described, though he spoke with the smooth calm of someone used to dangerous conversations. "You were expecting someone else," Holmes said, hands in his coat pockets. "Henry Langford, perhaps?" Ellis's eyes flicked between us, calculating. "I don't know the name." "No?" Holmes replied. "Then you'll forgive me if I assume you're merely standing under a gaslight in the precise location referenced in a cipher written in that very man's dying hand by complete coincidence." Ellis smiled thinly. "You speak in
Riddles, Mr. Holmes. Riddles are born from truths hidden too long, Holmes said, and I intend to expose this one before someone else dies. Ellis shifted his weight. You assume I know something. Perhaps I do, but you must understand I am not a free man. I work for Sir Reuben, and Sir Reuben does not take kindly to disobedience. Holmes's voice was low and hard. You are not a servant, Mr. Ellis. You are a fixer. Your hands are clean, not because you avoid crime, but because you pay others to commit it. And now a young man is dead, and a woman hides in fear of her own father. I suggest you decide which direction your loyalty truly lies." Ellis was silent for a long moment. Then he looked away toward the fogged street. "I never meant for Henry to die," he said at last. "I was told to scare him, intimidate him into leaving the country, but when he refused, when he tried to return, others were brought in, men I don't control." Holmes stepped closer. "Where did they hold him?" "In an old mill near the river, disused. Sir Reuben owns it. He kept Langford there for weeks. They broke him, Mr. Holmes, not just physically. He was made to believe that Charlotte had betrayed him, that she'd gone through with the engagement. He didn't want to believe it, but it wore him down. And yet, I said, he came back for her." Ellis nodded slowly. "He learned the truth. One of the guards, young, soft-hearted, slipped him a paper. The truth about the Follingsby match falling through. It reignited something. He escaped 2 nights ago. I was meant to intercept him before he got far." "But you didn't," Holmes said. "I let him go," Ellis admitted. "He was already half dead, bleeding. He said he had one message left to leave, something that would reach you. I told him where this gaslight stood. I didn't know he'd be killed." Holmes stared at him, face unreadable. Then he said, "You will take us to the mill. Tonight. If Langford left anything else behind, letters, proof of confinement, we will find it. And if Sir Reuben's men are there, then we will see whether truth still has a weapon sharper than silence." Ellis hesitated, then gave a single nod. And so, with the fog deepening around us and the last echoes of Langford's coded melody still whispering in Holmes's mind, we turned from the gaslight and stepped into the heart of darkness where lies had lived too long in the shadows. The carriage rattled through the night streets with grim purpose, the horses' hooves echoing off brick and stone as we made our way southward toward the river. Holmes sat opposite me, his face half lit by the flickering carriage lamp. Ellis, silent for much of the ride, leaned slightly forward, his cane tapping nervously against the floorboards as though trying to mark time that had long since slipped from his control. "There will be a
watchman," he muttered finally. "An old man named Jarrow, harmless unless someone's paid him to pretend otherwise." "Let us hope his conscience remains affordable," Holmes said, his voice clipped. "If Henry Langford was kept here for weeks, there will be signs, discarded clothes, shackles, marks of confinement, and I mean to find them all." "I warn you," Ellis said, glancing at the curtained window. "If Reuben Fenwick learns we were here, I will not be able to shield you." "You mistake me, Mr. Ellis," Holmes replied. "I have no expectation of being shielded, only of seeing this to the end." The mill loomed into view soon after, a hulking, derelict silhouette of red brick and broken windows crouched against the Thames like a discarded relic of industrial ambition. It had once been part of a bustling textile network, but now the only sounds came from the distant lap of the river and the creak of metal straining under its own rust. Ellis disembarked first, gesturing for us to keep back. He approached a small side door, tapped 3 times, then twice more in quick succession. After a beat, the door cracked open and an old, stooped man with a lantern peered out. Holmes and I remained still, as Ellis muttered a few quiet words. There was a grunt, a sceptical glance, then a reluctant nod. We entered through the narrow doorway and found ourselves in a cavernous interior. The air was thick with dust and mildew, and the scent of damp brick and ancient grease clung to every surface. The floor was layered in grime and bird droppings, but there were footprints, fresh ones, visible in the grit. Holmes bent to examine them, then motioned us to follow. "Upstairs," Ellis whispered. "They kept him in the foreman's office. Barred windows, no easy exit." Holmes said nothing, but the sharp focus in his movements told me he had already catalogued 3 alternate exits and every possible blind spot in the room. We climbed a narrow staircase that groaned underfoot and emerged into a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with rusting iron hooks and frayed rope. The office lay at the far end, a grim little cell of a room with soot-darkened glass, 1 splintered desk, and an iron-framed bed bolted to the floor. Holmes entered first, lantern held high. The beam swept across the room and came to rest on a small pile of folded papers beneath a floorboard that had clearly been loosened and replaced with care. "Here," Holmes said, "our missing proof." He knelt and retrieved the bundle. I moved beside him, holding the light steady. The top sheet was a page torn from a ledger, scrawled over in pencil with a shaky hand. "Kept here against my will. Day 23, I believe. Told Charlotte had married. Do not believe them. If anyone finds this, tell her I never gave up. H.L." The next few sheets were less legible. Scribbled measures of music, fragmented phrases, attempted ciphers, many crossed, out and rewritten. One phrase, repeated multiple times, sent a chill through me. "The mill hides more than men." Holmes studied this page the longest. He suspected the mill was not merely a prison, he said. "There's something else here." Ellis stood by the door, watching us with a guarded expression. "It's possible. Sir Reuben didn't use this place just for Langford. I've seen other deliveries. Crates, sealed, taken in late at night. I assumed it was old stock, or private shipping." Holmes turned sharply. "When was the last delivery?" 2 nights ago, shortly before Langford escaped. Holmes was already moving, his eyes scanning the corners of the room. He turned his attention to the far wall where an iron heating pipe ran down into the floor. Then, with sudden purpose, he crossed to the bookcase that leaned awkwardly against the plaster. "Watson, give me a hand." We shifted the case aside with effort, the base scraping against the floor. Behind it, the wall bore signs of tampering, fresh mortar, uneven bricks. Holmes rapped against the stone with his knuckles. A hollow thud answered. "Help me with your knife," he said. I passed him the blade, and he began to pry at the mortar, chipping away until one brick gave, then another. Behind them, a narrow cavity yawned, just large enough to conceal a small trunk. Holmes pulled it free and placed it on the desk. The lock had already been broken, though clumsily. He opened it to reveal stacks of paper-wrapped parcels, each bearing the seal of the Foreign Trade Office. Ellis paled. "That's government property." "No," Holmes said coolly. "It is stolen government property, smuggled goods, likely documents or bonds, possibly letters intended for blackmail. Whatever they are worth imprisoning a man to protect." He rifled through one packet and extracted a series of letters marked Private-Cabinet Office. He read only the opening line before returning it to its wrapping. "That," he said, "explains everything." I stared at him. "Holmes, do you mean to say Sir Reuben has been running an espionage ring out of his old mill?" "More likely a blackmail operation using stolen correspondence, political, diplomatic, perhaps even royal. Langford stumbled into it, likely by accident, and they couldn't let him go. That's why they painted over the message, and why Ellis was sent to scare him." Ellis looked ill. "I didn't know what was in the crates, I swear to you." "Perhaps not," Holmes said without sympathy. "But now you do. And your silence would make you complicit. I suggest you consider your options carefully." From the stairwell below came a sudden sound. Footsteps. More than one set, moving fast. Holmes stiffened. "We've been followed. Quickly, Watson, gather the papers." I shoved the documents into my coat as Holmes extinguished the lantern. He cracked the door and peered into the hall. 3 men, armed, not constables." "We go out the back," Ellis whispered. Holmes nodded, and we moved quickly, retracing our steps down the staircase and past the central factory floor. Holmes led the way into a loading bay where rotted crates lay scattered and a single boarded window faced the riverbank. He kicked it free and dropped to the muddy path below. The rest of us followed in haste, just as a shout rang out above and gunfire cracked through the empty air. We ran, ducking low beneath the wharf scaffolding, until we reached the shadows beneath a docked barge. Holmes motioned for silence. The men gave brief chase, but in the confusion of fog and night, they soon lost interest. We emerged a quarter-hour later, soaked and shivering but alive. Holmes hailed another cab and we climbed aboard. No one spoke until we were well beyond the river's edge. "Now," Holmes said finally, "we take these documents to Mycroft." "Your brother?" I asked. "There are names in these letters that could collapse entire ministries," he said, "and Sir Reuben has placed himself at the center of a web larger than we first suspected." Ellis leaned forward, his face ashen. "Will I be arrested?" "That depends," Holmes replied coolly. "Are you prepared to testify against Sir Reuben Fenwick?" After a long silence, Ellis gave a single nod. Holmes exhaled. "Then you may yet survive this intact." We arrived at Baker Street shortly after midnight. Miss Fenwick was waiting, seated upright with wide eyes and trembling hands. Holmes placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Your father," he said. is not the man you believed him to be." And for the first time that night, she did not cry. Morning broke with a pale and uncertain light over Baker Street, washing the room in a weak silver that seemed reluctant to commit itself fully to the day. Holmes had not slept. He stood at the window, silhouetted against the milky dawn, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. On the table behind him lay the unwrapped contents of the trunk from the mill, parchments, sealed letters, diplomatic missives, and a list of names that read like the guest registry of a foreign embassy or the whispered payroll of a very discreet scandal. Miss Fenwick had gone to bed after we returned, though I doubted she had found much rest. The events of the night had drained her of tears, but not of feeling. Ellis, after a long and tense conversation, had been placed under the watch of Inspector Hopkins, summoned quietly in the early hours at Holmes's request. Hopkins had proven both discreet and surprisingly sympathetic, perhaps because, as Holmes noted wryly, there were few in Scotland Yard who had not yet been disappointed by their own superiors. I emerged from the guest room shortly after 7, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Holmes turned from the window. "You're awake," he said. "Good. We have work." "I rather assumed," I said, crossing to pour a cup of the bitter black coffee Holmes had brewed. "Though I imagine I'll need more than caffeine to make sense of everything we uncovered last night." He gestured to the stack of documents. "We are in possession of material that implicates Sir Reuben Fenwick in the systematic theft and concealment of classified communications. He used the old mill not only as a personal prison, but as a dead-drop location for intercepted messages. The nature of some of these items suggests involvement from persons with access to both domestic and foreign intelligence channels." I sat down, slowly. "So, Langford stumbled into a conspiracy far larger than his personal tragedy." Holmes nodded, and they imprisoned him for it. "But here's what troubles me most. Why kill him now? Why not eliminate him earlier? He was held for weeks, broken, manipulated, misinformed, but not murdered. Then he escapes, and within 24 hours he is stabbed in the street by a man or men unknown. You think Sir Reuben didn't order his death?" "I think," Holmes said, "that something changed. Perhaps Langford learned something in captivity he was never meant to know, something worth killing over." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, announcing Mycroft Holmes in her usual mixture of awe and exasperation. Mycroft entered, glancing distastefully at the clutter. "You've made quite the mess, Sherlock. I trust this is all in aid of something important." "It is," Holmes said. "The papers are yours. They require secure handling and redaction where necessary. I believe some of the foreign correspondences relate to trade arrangements with the Ottoman delegation." Mycroft sifted through the files, his expression tightening with each passing sheet. "You've just handed me enough political leverage to collapse half of Whitehall." "Then use it," Holmes replied, "to bring down Sir Reuben Fenwick." Mycroft arched a brow. "Reuben Fenwick is not a man easily dislodged. His influence touches Parliament, the police, the press." "And the grave of Henry Langford," Holmes snapped. "I've no patience for your delicacies. The man must be arrested. This conspiracy ends with him." Mycroft studied his brother carefully, then glanced at me. "And you're both certain he orchestrated the murder?" "No," Holmes said slowly. "That's just it. I am not certain, but someone close to him did. And I intend to force that truth into the light." Mycroft tapped the table with a gloved finger. "Very well. I'll arrange for the contents of this trunk to disappear into the appropriate departments, quietly. But if you're going to corner Fenwick, Sherlock, be careful. When a man builds a life on secrets, he'll kill to keep even one from being exposed." Holmes gave no reply, and Mycroft left soon after, disappearing like a shadow across a chessboard. We ate in silence, Holmes picking absently at a slice of dry toast, and by 10 o'clock we were again in motion. Miss Fenwick, pale but composed, insisted on accompanying us. "If I am part of this," she said, "I should see it through." Holmes did not object. We arrived at the Fenwick estate just after 10:30. The sky had cleared, but the air carried a sharp wind, and the gatekeeper watched us approach with the wary resignation of a man used to unexpected callers bearing trouble. Sir Reuben received us in his study, a cavernous room of dark leather and heavier secrets. He was a stout man with silver hair, too tightly combed, and a beard that seemed to mask more than his jaw. His eyes, cold and quick, lit on Holmes with the faintest sneer of recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes wasted no time. "To the death of Henry Langford." Sir Reuben's expression did not change. "I'm unfamiliar with the name." "You're not," Holmes said. "You employed him to tutor your daughter. When he fell in love with her, you had him dismissed and threatened. When he planned to elope with her, he vanished. And when he escaped your custody, he was murdered." Sir Reuben laughed, a dry and humourless sound. "This is absurd. Are you here in an official capacity?" Holmes smiled thinly. "If you prefer official, I can summon half the yard, but I suspect you'd prefer the quiet option. Less fuss, fewer reporters. My brother is already handling the material we recovered from the mill." "Your mill?" Sir Reuben's jaw tightened. "You have no proof." Holmes stepped forward. "We have the ledger Langford kept in captivity. We have a cipher note recovered from a concealed wall. We have your man Ellis, who has agreed to testify." That landed. A flicker of something, panic, rage, passed through Sir Reuben's eyes. "Ellis is a coward," he said. "If he's talking, he's lying." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "but not alone. The guards at the mill have vanished. The property has been swept clean. Someone's trying to erase you, Sir Reuben." The baronet's facade began to crack. "I built everything I have, everything Charlotte wears, eats, lives in. It's mine. And you think I'll lose all that because of a sentimental young fool who couldn't mind his place?" Holmes turned to Miss Fenwick. "And what does your daughter think of that legacy?" Charlotte's voice was low, but clear. "I think it is built on rot, and it deserves to fall." Sir Reuben's mouth opened, but no words came. Holmes drew breath to speak again when another voice rang out from the hallway. Inspector Lestrade, brisk and officious. "Sir Reuben Fenwick," he called, stepping into the room with a pair of constables. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful imprisonment, and suspected complicity in the murder of Henry Langford." The room froze. Sir Reuben turned to Holmes with venom in his stare. "This isn't over." "No," Holmes agreed, stepping aside as the constables advanced. "But your influence is—" The baronet was led out in silence. Charlotte collapsed into a chair, trembling with a force she could no longer contain. Holmes crossed to her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did not need to speak today," he said. "But you did, and it mattered." She looked up, eyes shining. "Will it be enough?" "It will," Holmes replied, "because the rest is already in motion." And with that, the long shadows cast by Fenwick's secrets began to fade, first slowly, then completely. It was nearly noon when we emerged from the Fenwick estate, the crisp wind cutting across the lawn as if to erase the last trace of our visit. Sir Reuben had gone quietly under Lestrade's supervision, but not without a final, lingering glance at his daughter that bespoke not remorse, but wounded pride, a man undone not by law or justice, but by his inability to control those he believed owed him their silence. Holmes, for his part, seemed to walk in calm reflection, his long coat flaring behind him as we returned to the waiting cab. He said nothing for several minutes. Only when the wheels began to turn, and Charlotte, seated beside me, leaned her head wearily against the window pane, did Holmes speak. "The lion is caged," he murmured, "but there is still a snake in the grass." I turned toward him, puzzled. "You think the danger is not over?" He gave a faint shake of the head. Langford's murder, it was too precise. Not the work of men fleeing exposure, but of someone protecting a secret still in play. Sir Reuben may have orchestrated the blackmail operation, but I no longer believe he ordered Langford's death. Charlotte straightened at this. "But he held him captive." "Yes," Holmes said, meeting her eyes. "But killing Langford the moment he escaped, after all that effort to break and re-educate him, makes no sense. Someone else knew what Henry had discovered. Someone who feared what he might reveal once free." I frowned. "You suspect another figure inside the network?" Holmes looked out the window, his gaze unfocused. "Possibly not within the network itself. Consider, Watson, Langford was held, yes, but also manipulated, fed misinformation. Someone put the idea in his head that Charlotte had betrayed him. Then, when the illusion collapsed, he was allowed to escape, too easily. He evaded seasoned guards and stumbled directly to Baker Street, bypassing half the city." "Why?" "To deliver the cipher," I said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "A cipher built around music, a skill set only Langford possessed. He hid a message in melody, a message pointing to Ellis, to the gaslight meeting, and to something still buried in that mill, but the cipher also did something else." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the original musical staff. "It implicated Ellis, but not conclusively, and Ellis led us straight to the documents. All very tidy, don't you think?" I blinked. "You believe Ellis was manipulated too?" "Ellis believed himself to be orchestrating a rescue," Holmes said. "But I believe he was the one being used, to lure us to the documents and draw our attention to Sir Reuben while the true architect of Langford's demise slipped past, unremarked." Charlotte's voice was a whisper. "Who?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question that still eludes me." We arrived back at Baker Street to find Inspector Hopkins waiting with an envelope. He rose from the fireside chair as we entered. "Urgent post," he said. "Delivered by hand not half an hour ago. No name on the outside." Holmes opened it with a flick of the knife he kept on the mantel. Inside was a single sheet, cream-coloured, with neat, almost mechanical handwriting. The girl was never the target. The song was meant for a wider audience. "Bury your victory, Mr. Holmes, while you still have time." Beneath it, drawn in red ink, was the treble clef from Langford's cipher. Holmes's face darkened. He passed the letter to me, and I read it aloud again. Charlotte clutched the edge of her shawl. "They're threatening you." "No," Holmes said quietly. "They're warning me. There's more at stake than Langford's death. His cipher wasn't just a call for help, it was a map, a trail to a truth that's still hidden." Hopkins cleared his throat. "Sir Reuben's been placed in custody. His solicitors raising a storm, of course, but between Ellis's testimony and the materials from the mill, the Crown prosecution is already laying charges." Holmes nodded. "Keep him there, but make no public announcements. Let them think we've accepted the victory. It may force the next player's hand." Hopkins hesitated, then left. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I need to revisit the cipher. Every version Langford wrote, especially the failed ones." He was trying to say more than he dared risk in words. We spread the recovered pages across the desk. Some were scratched through, others incomplete. Holmes examined each, drawing lines and annotations, humming quiet snatches to himself. Then he froze. "Here," he said. "This version, do you see?" I looked. It's almost the same sequence, but there's a change in bar 4. Holmes nodded. Exactly, a shift in key. It's subtle, but deliberate. He moves from G major to E minor, relative key, same scale, different mood. What does it signify? It's not about music, Holmes said. It's about direction. If this cipher overlays not sound, but place... He grabbed a street map of London and laid it flat. Then, taking a ruler, he began plotting distances based on the structure of the bars and the scale of Langford's original melody. At first, it seemed ludicrous, matching musical intervals to physical streets, but as Holmes marked intersections, a pattern began to emerge. "A route," he murmured. "Look here, B3K, Granby Street, the gaslight at Chancery Lane, and this final point, the abandoned railway tunnel beneath Shoreditch." I frowned. What would be hidden there? "Something Langford was willing to die to reveal," Holmes said. "He left us a map to the final truth, and I believe it's still waiting to be found." Charlotte's voice was taut with fear. "Is it dangerous?" "Without question," Holmes replied. "Which is why we must go there before they bury it, or bury someone else trying to find it." Within the hour, we were in another hired cab, cutting through the grey East London streets toward Shoreditch. The air thickened with soot and the reek of damp earth as we descended past disused signal sheds and into the ruins of an old switching station. The tunnel mouth gaped like a wound in the landscape, sealed only by rusting bars, which Holmes made quick work of with a crowbar he'd borrowed from Hopkins's tool chest. The darkness inside was total. We lit lanterns and pressed forward, each step echoing off the brick walls like a reminder we were no longer welcome in the world above. Rats scurried through debris. Old rails gleamed faintly beneath layers of grime. Holmes led with steady pace, matching Langford's mapped rhythm to the turns and forks. At last, we came to a bricked-off alcove, a storage niche from the original construction. Holmes stopped. "This is it." We began searching, tapping stones, inspecting floorboards. It was I who found the false panel, a slab of mortar that gave way to a hollow behind. Inside was a metal strongbox, sealed with a complex lock. Holmes made quick work of it. Within were letters, hundreds of them, signed with names we recognized: ministers, foreign agents, industrial magnates. Correspondence implicating not only Sir Reuben, but others, competitors, collaborators. Half the conspiracy had remained hidden even from Fenwick himself. Holmes withdrew one letter and read it in silence. Then he handed it to me. It was addressed to a man already in Parliament discussing the silencing of a liability whose talents had proven inconveniently idealistic. Langford. Charlotte turned away, covering her mouth with her hand. Holmes locked the box. This is the true route, the rot below the rot, and now we have it. I looked at him. "And the warning? They'll come for this," he said, "but now we'll be ready." And as we emerged from the tunnel back into the light, the pages in our possession, the last bars of Langford's melody, echoed quietly in my mind, no longer a cry in the dark, but a song that would end with justice. We returned to Baker Street as the first blush of dusk settled over London, its smoky hues curling around chimneys and dampening the glint of street lamps. The journey back had been made in silence, the weight of what we had discovered in the tunnel pressing down like a winter fog. Charlotte Fenwick sat between Holmes and me in the cab, her face unreadable, one gloved hand resting lightly atop the strong box containing the documents. She did not cry, nor speak, nor even look out the window. There was, I felt, a transformation underway in her, a soft resolve hardening into something quietly unbreakable. Back at 221B, Holmes double-locked the front door and drew the heavy curtains. He placed the strongbox on the desk with a care I had seen him reserve only for volatile chemicals and pieces of human skull. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he turned to me. "You see now, Watson," he said, "why Langford's murder was no mere final act in a sordid love affair. This box contains the true calculus of his death." I nodded. It wasn't just Sir Reuben, he was a cog. Exactly. And he had no idea how large the machine was that turned around him. Holmes poured 2 fingers of brandy into a glass and passed it to Charlotte. She took it wordlessly, sipping as though merely to oblige civility. Holmes sat opposite her. "There are names in this collection, Miss Fenwick, that implicate not only businessmen and civil servants, but lords, diplomats, and members of the Foreign Office. These correspondences suggest a conspiracy rooted not in ideology, but opportunity, profiteering from secrets and fears. Your father trafficked in more than letters. He trafficked in influence." Charlotte finally spoke. "Then this, what Henry found, is enough to bring them down?" "Yes," Holmes said. "But not directly, not yet. This network thrives in the shadows. If we simply expose these letters publicly, they'll dismiss them as forgeries, persecute their own scapegoats, and vanish into new guises. No, we must strike at the heart, with precision, which is why we cannot go to the newspapers." I saw where Holmes's thoughts were leading. "You mean to coordinate with Mycroft?" Holmes nodded. "He alone has the clearance, the contacts, and the discretion required. Mycroft can wield this weapon more effectively than any court of law." Charlotte set down the glass with a soft clink. "And what of me? Of Henry?" Holmes leaned forward, his expression unusually gentle. "Your part in this is already finished. You have risked enough. What remains is for us to ensure that your name does not become collateral in the reckoning to come." At that moment, a sharp knock echoed from the door below. Holmes stiffened. "That is not Mrs. Hudson's knock." I instinctively reached for the revolver in the desk drawer. Holmes motioned for silence and crossed to the peephole in the door. After a brief glance, he stepped back. "Just as I feared," he murmured, "too soon." He opened the door slowly to reveal a man in a dark coat with an envelope in hand and a false smile fixed unnaturally to his face. "Mr. Holmes?" the man asked in a clipped tone. "Message from the Home Office." Holmes took the envelope but did not open it. "You're not from the Home Office," he said calmly. "Your collar is of military issue, and your boots bear residue from the Thames foreshore. No desk-man walks in lime-rich silt." The man's smile faltered, but he did not move. Holmes stepped aside. "You may tell your handler that we've received the message, and that it has not changed our intentions." For a long moment the man said nothing. Then he nodded once, turned, and vanished into the dusk. I shut the door behind him, bolting it with care. "A warning?" "A final attempt at intimidation," Holmes replied. "It confirms our suspicion. We've touched a nerve." I turned to Charlotte, who had not moved during the exchange. "You're safe here. They won't act openly." She shook her head. "But I'm not safe, am I?" "No," Holmes said. "Not until this is finished. But I've already made arrangements." He crossed to his desk and retrieved another envelope sealed with red wax. "Inside is everything we have. Copies of the key documents, Langford's cipher, even the intercepted letters from the mill. I've written instructions for Mycroft to follow. If anything happens to me, this envelope is to be opened and sent to the Prime Minister." He placed it in my hands. "Watson, you are to deliver this personally to Pall Mall if I do not return by midnight tomorrow." My mouth went dry. "Return from where?" "From the Webb Centre," Holmes said quietly. "The man behind the warning, the one who gave the order to kill Langford and orchestrated the illusion of Ellis's betrayal, the one who stands to lose the most if these letters reach the wrong hands." "You know who he is?" I asked. Holmes nodded once. "I've known since this morning. The signature was buried in a letter to an Eastern trading company, but the cipher Langford embedded in the musical shift named him clearly." Charlotte rose slowly. "Who?" Holmes's eyes met hers. "Lord Edwin Balcombe," she gasped. "But he's my father's closest friend, a regular guest. He was the one who introduced us to the Follingsby family." "And provided the leverage your father needed for business abroad," Holmes added. "Balcombe isn't just a peer with influence. He's the key broker for several Eastern trade routes and a silent partner in 2 foreign banks. The documents we now hold prove he orchestrated intelligence leaks and blackmail schemes disguised as commercial diplomacy." I looked down at the envelope in my hands. "Then he'll come. For this, he won't need to," Holmes said, "because I'm going to him." I started. "You cannot go alone." "I won't," Holmes interrupted, "but I must go directly. If he suspects we're closing in, he'll destroy the rest of the network before dawn. We need him to believe he can still salvage it. I'll use the original letters as bait. We draw him out, force a confession, or catch him in the act of obstruction. Lestrade will be nearby with a warrant, and Hopkins will be posted as backup. I need you, Watson, at the perimeter, and Miss Fenwick here with the envelope as our final safeguard." Charlotte protested. "But if anything happens to you—" Holmes turned to her with surprising softness. "Then let it be said that for once I did not leave a tune unfinished." The plan was drawn in minutes, swift and precise. By 10 o'clock that night, Holmes was already en route to Lord Balcombe's club, the original letters folded into a satchel under his arm, the grim certainty of danger reflected in his narrowed eyes. As the clock struck 11, I stood waiting outside the club's rear entrance, revolver in hand, every shadow a potential threat. And still I could not shake the echo of Langford's melody playing again in my mind, not a dirge, but a warning. The game was nearly at its end, and I feared, more than anything, that Holmes would make himself the final note. The street outside the Carlton Club was silent, save for the faint clatter of a distant cab and the rustle of wind as it slipped through the ornate balustrades. I stood beneath the cover of a soot-darkened awning, my coat collar turned high, and one hand resting inside my pocket upon the revolver's cold grip. From my vantage point near the alley entrance, I could just make out the eastern facade of the club, its windows glowing golden with gaslight, its opulence gleaming even in the subdued hush of midnight. Holmes was inside, alone. He had passed through the heavy oak doors precisely at 10:30, dressed in a charcoal suit a shade more formal than his usual, his cravat tied with surgical exactness. He had gone in not as a detective, but as an equal to those he meant to confront, a man with knowledge, not suspicion, evidence, not insinuation. I had watched him go with a tightening in my chest that no field surgeon's resolve could settle. We had rehearsed the plan thrice over before he departed. Lestrade and 2 constables were positioned within earshot, waiting in a hansom 3 blocks north. Inspector Hopkins remained near the rear entrance, cloaked and seated as a beggar against a pile of crates. If Holmes signalled, or if things turned violent, we were to converge, but no signal had come. I checked my watch again, 11:14. Each minute now drew longer, every sound more suspect. Still I waited, straining to hear any hint of movement from within, any rise in voices or hurried footsteps. There was nothing. And then, at last, the door opened. Holmes stepped out, the satchel still tucked beneath his arm. He looked composed, even calm, but I could read the tautness behind his eyes. He crossed the street directly to me, said nothing, but gestured that we walk. Only once we had rounded the corner did he speak. "He confessed, Watson." I stopped. "To everything?" "Two enough," Holmes said grimly. He spoke of Langford with contempt, called him a naive little romantic. He admitted the orders passed through intermediaries, that Ellis was manipulated into leading Langford to me so that we might uncover the mill and disgrace Sir Reuben. Balcom was more than willing to sacrifice Fenwick to protect the real operation. The moment Sir Reuben was arrested, the rest of the network began collapsing, some by design, some by fear. "And Langford's murder?" I asked. Holmes's jaw set. He did not order it himself, but he ensured it would happen. The final hand was one of his men, acting under what Balcom called necessary implication. A phrase fit for a boardroom, not a corpse. A bitter chill settled over me as we walked on, the club now well behind us. "And he said all this freely?" Holmes gave a small, sharp smile. "He believed he was negotiating. He offered me names. Many I already suspected, and in exchange he demanded the strongbox be returned to him for proper disposal. He even dared to suggest my silence could be compensated." I exhaled slowly. "And now?" "Now," Holmes said, pausing beneath a lamp, "we allow Lestrade to perform his part." We returned to the alley entrance, just as Lestrade and Hopkins emerged from their positions, quick-footed and pale-faced from waiting. Holmes relayed the substance of Balcom's admission in succinct terms. "It's not enough for trial," Lestrade admitted, rubbing his chin, "but with the strongbox in hand and the testimonies already collected, we can confront him with the full weight of evidence. He'll fold." "He already has," Holmes said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Within the hour, Lord Balcom was arrested under quiet, calculated force. The club's staff offered no resistance. Many turned their faces away. The man himself barely spoke a word as he was escorted from the building, his features carved in stone, only a flicker of recognition passing over them as he looked once at Holmes and said, "You should have taken the offer." Holmes didn't reply. By 2 o'clock that morning, we were once more gathered in Baker Street, the strongbox now safely under lock in Mycroft's care, the rest of the original letters sealed and marked for official classification. Charlotte sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, but she seemed not to notice. "There will be repercussions," I said quietly. "Balcom may fall, but others, his allies, his financiers, will vanish before dawn. Some will escape." "They always do," Holmes murmured. He had discarded his coat and sat with his legs crossed, a cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. "But enough has been exposed. The network will collapse from within, and the names we do hold will ensure that no successor can rebuild it easily." Charlotte looked up. "What of Henry?" Holmes's gaze turned to the fire. "He has been avenged, not merely with arrests, but with the truth." His message was heard. His cipher broke the silence. In the end, he outwitted men who believed him broken. She swallowed. "Then may he rest." I rose and crossed to the desk, where the glove still lay, the one Langford had carried to Baker Street, bloodied but undestroyed. I placed it gently into Charlotte's hands. "He died to protect you," I said. "But I believe more than that. He died to protect what you stood for in his eyes, a future without fear. One not purchased by secrets or shaped by coercion." She nodded, silent, her hand curling around the glove like a vow. Holmes stood and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to peer into the dark street below. "They'll come quietly in the press," he said. "Whispers of disgrace. A transfer here, a resignation there. Balcom will vanish from the social registers. Sir Reuben will live out his days in a coastal prison, attended by men who call him Sir without irony. There will be no headlines, No public reckoning. I joined him at the window. And does that satisfy you? Holmes exhaled smoke into the cold glass. Number, but it protects her. We said no more that night. Charlotte remained with Mrs. Hudson at Holmes's insistence, and I watched as she finally slept, a long, dreamless rest earned not by comfort, but by completion. Holmes sat awake until dawn, composing a letter in silence. When I asked whom it was for, he replied only, "A friend who knows what to do with truths that cannot be spoken aloud." And as the light filtered in through the smoky curtain of London's morning, I knew that this case, one spun from melody and blood, deception and devotion, had ended not with applause or spectacle, but with the kind of quiet Holmes valued most, the silence of justice finally done. The fire in the grate had burned low by the time Holmes finally rose from his chair. A faint wash of pale dawn filtered through the curtains of 221B Baker Street, limning the outlines of our modest sitting room in soft silver. Outside, the street was still slumbering, though the faint clatter of early milk carts echoed faintly in the chill air. Holmes moved to the window not to observe, but, as I had come to understand, to reflect. His profile in the grey light was worn, not from exhaustion alone, but from a kind of inward stillness that settled only after prolonged strain. I had been dozing, lightly in the armchair opposite, my revolver tucked away, my coat slung over the backrest. At Holmes's movement I stirred, blinking away the remnants of sleep. "Anything?" I asked, though I knew he would have heard nothing. "No," he said softly. For once, the night passed without incident. No letters under the door, no strangers on the stoop, no further threats, only quiet. "Is it over, then?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He traced his fingers along the window latch before turning. "As over as it can be. The strongbox is with Mycroft. The letters are in government hands, classified and locked away, where only the most senior eyes will read them. Balcom will be interrogated under terms not listed in public record. Sir Reuben will face trial. Ellis has vanished into protective custody." He paused, his eyes drifting briefly toward the guest room where Charlotte slept. "And Miss Fenwick will have a future unmarred by her father's crimes." I nodded, exhaling deeply. "Langford gave us the map, but it was you who followed it to the end." Holmes offered a faint smile, but there was no triumph in it. "Langford's brilliance was not in creating a cipher I could solve. It was in trusting that someone would try, that his message, however fractured, might still find an ear willing to listen. The courage to believe in that, to leave behind music as truth when words failed, was not something I expected." He walked to the desk where the glove still lay, and beside it a small sheet of manuscript paper, a fragment of Langford's cipher that Holmes had set aside. Holmes picked it up, his brow furrowed, and turned it over. "There was one line," he said, "I couldn't place before." He held it out to me. The notation was sparse, a few ascending notes, a rest, and then what looked like a modulation. At first I saw nothing of interest, but Holmes's expression told me otherwise. "Listen," he said, crossing to his violin. He brought the instrument to his shoulder, tuned it silently, and then drew the bow across the strings with the gentlest touch. The melody rose softly, a haunting phrase, simple, lyrical, and then dipped into a minor chord before resolving again. It took me a moment to recognize it. "That's not just music." "No," Holmes agreed. "It's a question, or a signature, depending how you hear it. The final phrase is identical to a passage in the third movement of Langford's unfinished sonata, one he began composing before his disappearance." "And it ends," Holmes said with a rest. I frowned. "A musical pause?" "No," Holmes replied, "a message. Not the end, not silence, only waiting. He lowered the violin. This, he continued, was never meant to conclude with arrests. Langford wasn't just exposing a conspiracy, he was preserving a legacy. That final rest means continue the
melody. I looked at him. Do you mean Charlotte? She is his final bar, Holmes said simply. His warning preserved her, his cipher exposed the rot, but his music, his gift, he passed that to her. And perhaps one day she'll complete it. He turned and carefully replaced the violin. Then almost absently he added, she should leave London. Not in fear, but for freedom. She will, I said. I spoke to her before she slept. She has an aunt in Vienna, her mother's sister, a pianist. She's been invited to stay as long as she wishes. Holmes nodded. Good, Vienna is far enough and full of music. The morning wore on, and gradually the world resumed its indifferent rhythm. Mrs. Hudson brought tea with a raised eyebrow and a muttered remark about men who don't sleep and women who vanish with too many secrets. We said nothing. Her loyalty had always been more perceptive than her patience. Charlotte awoke mid-morning, dressed plainly, and carried herself with the quiet strength of someone no longer uncertain of her place in the world. She stood before the hearth as Holmes handed her the monogrammed glove. It's yours, he said. She took it, held it in both hands, then tucked it gently into her coat pocket. I won't forget, she said. Not what he did, not what you did. Holmes inclined his head. Go with peace, Miss Fenwick. Let no one ever again dictate your story. An hour later, we saw her off in a hired cab bound for Victoria Station. She waved once as the cab turned the corner and disappeared. Holmes returned to the sitting room where he stood at the window once more. I joined him, both of us silent. You know, I said after some time, there was a moment when I believed you might not return from the Carlton Club. He glanced at me. And yet you remained at your post. As did you. We stood for another moment in the hush that followed. And now? I asked. Now, he said with a weary smile, I believe I'll sleep. But before he turned away, he reached into his pocket and drew out the final piece of the cipher, the fragment with the musical rest. He placed it on the desk beside the glove. It is not the end, he said softly. Only the pause before the melody begins again. And then, without further word, he turned and disappeared into his room, leaving me alone in the morning light, the air still gently echoing with the memory of a song that had saved a life, uncovered a crime, and quietly, improbably, changed Sherlock Holmes. By the time Holmes awoke late in the afternoon, the fog that had clung to the London streets since morning had thickened to a heavy, muffled hush. The world beyond our windows was wrapped in that peculiar grey which renders the city's outlines ghost-like and the gas lamps halos of pale gold. I had spent the quiet hours rereading the last of
Langford's letters, transcribing the cipher's passages, and tending to correspondence from Scotland Yard and Mycroft's office confirming Lord Balcombe's detainment. The web had been cut through, its core exposed, but there remained, as I suspected Holmes already knew, one final thread left to tie. He emerged freshly shaven, clear-eyed, and, if I may say so, somehow lighter than I had seen him in weeks. He crossed the room, noting the orderly piles of documentation I had arranged on the table. "You've been at work, Watson." "A poor imitation of your own methods," I said. "But yes, I've read every line, and I believe we may have overlooked one." Holmes raised a brow and took the sheet I offered. It was the short, unsigned note delivered to our door 2 nights before, the one bearing the warning. The girl was never the target. The song was meant for a wider audience. Bury your victory, Mr. Holmes, while you still have time. He read it again, eyes narrowing slightly. You see something now? I said. I see him, Holmes murmured. The author? He nodded. We assumed it was one of Balcom's men, perhaps even Balcom himself, attempting to dissuade us. But look at the phrasing. The girl was never the target, not is no longer, or was a mistake. This writer knew our assumptions and chose to correct them. And the line about the song, I asked, that it was meant for a wider audience, not for Charlotte, not even for me, which leads us to ask, who else could Langford have been trying to reach? Holmes walked to the hearth, standing before the low flames, eyes distant. There's only one person left. I blinked. Mycroft? No, he said slowly. The one man with the power to ensure Langford was never heard, and the conscience to regret it. The man who gave Langford a grant 3 years ago through an educational trust, who arranged for a private tutor to visit the Fenwick estate, who supported Sir Reuben's ventures quietly but with increasing reluctance. I stared at him. You don't mean... Yes, Holmes said, Langford's patron. The man who paid for his schooling and musical training, a silent benefactor. He turned toward me, and there was a strange softness in his eyes. Watson, Henry Langford was not only in love with Charlotte Fenwick, he was unwittingly her half-brother. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. Mycroft confirmed it this morning, Holmes went on. Through birth records concealed under a separate name. Her mother, as you may recall, died shortly after Charlotte's birth, but before marrying Reuben Fenwick she had a brief liaison with Lord Balcom. I sat down slowly, the implications settling like dust on old piano keys. And Langford never knew? Nor did Charlotte, but Balcom did, and more importantly so did another man. Holmes held up the note again. Ellis. But Ellis worked for Fenwick. Nominally, Holmes said. But I believe Ellis was placed there years ago by someone else, someone who wished to keep watch over the girl without drawing attention. I believe Ellis wrote this note, not as a threat, but a warning to steer us away from danger. He knew Langford's connection. He knew Balcom would stop at nothing if the truth emerged. I looked at the paper again. And now? Now, Holmes said, the truth is known to the right people. Ellis has disappeared, not to escape, but to protect Charlotte from a world that would seek to use her name for headlines and political leverage. The scandal is buried, the conspirators are exposed, and the siblings, however unknowingly, remained loyal to one another through a melody neither understood fully, but both trusted. There was a long silence then. Outside, the fog curled tighter. Inside, the fire cracked low, and the lamplight warmed the walls of Baker Street like the closing pages of a well-worn book. At last I said, "You once told me that there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact." Holmes smiled faintly. "And no truth more elegant than the one concealed in plain sight." He reached once more for his violin and drew the bow across the strings. The same notes Langford had left behind now played again, not as a riddle, but as a requiem. The melody swelled, dipped, and then resolved. Not in silence, but in harmony. It was, at last, the end. And somewhere in Vienna, I believed, Charlotte would begin the next bar,